She ran until her feet bled in the cold wilds of the West in 1883. A woman hunted by her past, carrying a fear and shame she could not name. At the end of the road, she met him, a silent cowboy with eyes the color of the earth and a heart torn by life. If it were you, when life pushed you to the end, would you continue to run away, or stop before the person who was willing to open his arms to welcome you? Is it possible to believe again, when faith once made you lose everything amidst the cold prairie winds? Two lonely souls must choose bury the past in silence, or dare to open their hearts to live again. Have you ever wondered if there is someone waiting for you halfway, if only you stop long enough to be found? Join me in the story, Mail Order Bride Ran Until Her Feet Bled. The cowboy met her halfway and never looked back. A journey of pain, courage, and healing. If you believe that love can save, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to start the story with me. The wind clawed at the open plain like a wild animal that had lost its way. Snow drifted sideways, cutting the air into white ribbons that stung Clara Hayes' face and filled the creases of her torn wedding dress. She could hardly see more than a few yards ahead, yet she kept running, one bare foot sinking deep after another into the freezing crust. Blood mixed with snow. Each step left a tiny red flower blooming behind her. The sound of the storm swallowed everything the echo of the world, the ache in her lungs, the sobs that never quite escaped her throat. Somewhere far off, maybe 10 miles behind, a man on horseback might still be following, or maybe he'd given up. She didn't know anymore. Fear had outridden reason hours ago. All she knew was the letter, that damned letter, the promise of a husband, a small cabin in Montana, and a life where she could plant geraniums in a tin can by the window. The handwriting had looked gentle, the words kind, but the man who met her at the station was not the one from her dreams. He had eyes the color of old brass and a laugh that scraped the skin off her hope. When he locked the door and told her a bride ought to earn her keep, Clara understood that she'd stepped into a different kind of war. So she ran, no coat, no boots, only a threadbare dress and the small silver locket her mother had pressed into her hand the day she left St. Louis. The snow thickened, erasing the world into white silence. Clara stumbled, knees striking the ice. Pain shot up her legs, bright and sharp, but she pushed herself up again. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each one freezing before it left her lips. In the vast loneliness, she began to whisper names to herself, her husband's, long gone in the war, her father's, the God she hadn't prayed to in years, anything to keep her heart from stopping. When she reached the frozen creek, she knelt by instinct, breaking a thin sheet of ice with trembling hands. The water bit her skin, but she drank anyway. She could taste iron, or maybe it was blood. The reflection in the water startled her, a ghostly woman, hair plastered with frost, eyes too wide, too tired. Was that still Clara Hayes, or just a shadow pretending to live somewhere in the blizzard? A sound cracked the silence, the distant rhythm of hooves, slow, measured, steady. Not like pursuit, like someone who'd been riding for a long, lonely time and had learned not to hurry. Clara froze. She couldn't tell if it was salvation or the end. She crawled behind a fallen pine, clutching her locket tight. Her heart thudded loud enough to drown the storm. The horse came closer. Through the white veil she could make out a tall rider, shoulders heavy under a wool coat, hat pulled low against the wind. He stopped, scanning the ground. Then his voice, deep and calm, cut through the snow. "Ma'am, You'll freeze out here." It wasn't the voice she'd been running from. It held no demand, no sharpness, only concern, worn thin by miles and years. Still, Clara didn't answer. Silence was safer than trust. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching softly. He moved slow, careful not to spook her. When he was close enough, he slid his coat from his shoulders and draped it across the snow between them, a quiet offering. Not a command. "Name's Ethan McGraw," he said, keeping his distance. "My ranch is a few miles east. There's fire and coffee, if you want it." The world blurred. Clara tried to speak, but the words broke apart in the wind. All she could manage was a whisper. "Please, don't take me back." He frowned, studying the blood on her feet, the torn hem of her dress. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, softly, "Reckon I don't need to know where you came from, just whether you aim to keep living." He held out his hand, gloved, steady, waiting. The snow hissed between them like a held breath. Clara hesitated. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "The right kind of silence can save your life, child." So she didn't answer. She simply reached for his hand. His grip was warm, rough like the bark of a sun-baked fence post. He lifted her easily, as though she weighed no more than a child. She felt the solid thump of his heartbeat through the layers of wool. It was the first living sound she'd trusted in months. Ethan set her gently across his horse's saddle, wrapped the coat around her shoulders, and mounted behind. The horse snorted, stamping at the snow, as they started toward the east. Clara looked back once the path she'd come already vanished, the storm swallowing her footprints whole. For the first time since she'd left St. Louis, she wasn't sure if she was escaping or arriving. The wind howled again, but softer now, almost like a lullaby. She leaned against him, too exhausted to fight the warmth creeping through her bones. The smell of leather and pine filled her lungs. She closed her eyes and whispered something no one could hear, not even herself. Maybe a prayer, maybe a goodbye. Ethan felt her weight grow heavier against his chest. He glanced down, saw her lashes crusted with ice. He murmured low, the words half lost to the storm. "Easy now, ma'am. You're safe for tonight, and for the first time in a long while." Clara let herself believe a man's promise. When Clara woke, the world was quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the land wrapped in pale morning light. For a long moment, she didn't know where she was. The air smelled of smoke and pine, and somewhere close, the slow rhythm of hooves shifted in the snow. Her body ached from cold and exhaustion. She lay on a bed made of furs and rough wool blankets inside a small log cabin. The fire crackled low in the stone hearth, casting orange shadows against the wooden walls. On a table near her, steam curled up from a tin cup of coffee. The sight almost made her weep. Ethan McGraw was standing near the stove, his back turned. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man shaped by years of work and silence. His coat was hung to dry beside the door, his revolver resting on the shelf above it. He turned when he heard her stir. "You're awake," he said simply. His voice was steady, deep like the low hum of the plains. Clara tried to sit up, and the blanket slipped from her shoulders. The bruises on her arms ached, but the heat from the fire was already easing the stiffness in her hands. She nodded, uncertain of what to say. He poured her a cup of coffee and set it on the table beside the bed. "It's weak," he said, "but it's warm." She reached for it with shaking fingers. "Thank you. You were near frozen when I found you," he said. Could have been a few more minutes and you wouldn't have made it." "I didn't think I would," she answered softly. He studied her for a long time. There were questions in his eyes, but he didn't ask them. He only turned back to the stove, poured another cup for himself, and leaned against the counter. "You got somewhere you need to be." Clara hesitated. Her mind went to the letter, to the name Samuel Boone, and the cabin she'd fled. The thought made her stomach twist. "No," she said finally. "Not anymore." Ethan nodded once, as if that was enough. "Then you can stay here until you're steady on your feet. The ranch is quiet this time of year. Snow keeps most folks inside." "I don't want to trouble you," she murmured. He looked over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am, if trouble looked like you, this country would be a far gentler place." Clara almost smiled, but it caught in her throat. She wasn't ready for humor yet. She spent the day wrapped in blankets near the fire, while Ethan went about his work outside. Through the small window, she watched him lead a pair of chestnut horses across the yard, his breath visible in the cold air. The way he moved was careful, unhurried, as if each motion had weight. He spoke to the animals in a low tone she couldn't hear, and they listened. By noon, the sun glowed weakly over the snowfields, and Clara felt well enough to stand. She found a clean dress folded beside her bed, coarse but warm. Someone had stitched the hem with neat, practical hands. She guessed it had belonged to another woman once. The thought lingered, quiet and sad. When Ethan came back, he carried a bucket of water and a loaf of cornbread wrapped in cloth. "You look better," he said, setting the food down. "I owe you my life." He shrugged. "You'd have done the same." She shook her head. "No one has, for a long time." They ate together at the small wooden table. The cornbread was dry but sweet, and the warmth of it spread through her chest. Outside, the wind had settled into a soft whisper across the hills. "After a while," Clara asked, "do you live here alone?" "Most of the time," Ethan replied. "I keep a few hands during spring branding. They come and go. Guess I got used to the quiet. You don't mind it?" He stared into his cup. "Sometimes the quiet's all that's left." Something in his tone made her pause. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It carried the weight of two lives that had lost more than they could ever explain. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat by the dying fire, watching the glow fade to embers. The cabin creaked as the wind shifted outside. For the first time in months, she wasn't running. The realization frightened her almost as much as the thought of being found. Her thoughts returned to the letter, to the man who'd sent it. She still had the envelope folded inside the pocket of her dress, though the ink had bled from the snow. She could almost hear Boone's voice again, sweet as syrup, promising love and safety. How many other women had believed him? How many had not survived to tell their story? She pressed a hand to her locket, feeling the cool metal against her skin. Inside was a small photograph of her husband, James Hayes. He'd died at Shiloh 20 years before, leaving her with nothing but debt and memories. Since then, she had lived by small acts of faith teaching, sewing, tending other people's children. But faith had run dry, and loneliness had done the rest. The door creaked open softly. Ethan stepped in from the porch, snow glinting on his coat. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. She shook her head. "The quiet keeps me awake." He smiled faintly. "Funny. It's what lets me rest." He poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her by the fire. They didn't speak for a long time. The flames painted their faces gold, and the silence between them grew comfortable. Finally, she asked, "Why did you stop? Why help a stranger in the middle of a storm?" He took a slow sip before answering. "Once, a stranger did the same for me. Didn't matter who I was or what I'd lost. Figured I owed the world one good turn." She looked at him, the lines of age and sun carved deep into his face. There was no pity there, no judgment, just patience, the kind that comes only from living through your own share of winters. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. The sound rose, lingered, and faded into the dark. Clara whispered, "You could have left me there." Ethan set down his cup. "Ma'am, I've buried enough people in the snow. Didn't need to add another." Tears stung her eyes, sudden and hot. She turned away, pretending to warm her hands at the fire. "I don't know what I can offer in return." He leaned back, resting his boots near the hearth. "Don't reckon kindness needs payment. Just don't run off into another storm, if you can help it." His voice was gentle but firm, and for the first time, she felt the edges of safety wrap around her like that old wool coat he'd given her. Later, as she lay on the cot, she listened to the wind sweep across the plains. The rhythm of it matched her breathing, slow and steady. Somewhere in the next room, Ethan moved, closing the shutters, checking the fire, humming a tune too low to make out. Clara closed her eyes. The last thing she felt was the warmth of the blanket, and the faint hope that maybe tomorrow the world would hurt a little less. Outside, dawn was still hours away, but a thin line of light had already started to climb the horizon. Morning came slow and pale. A thin mist rose from the snow, curling around the trees like breath from the earth itself. Clara stood by the window, her fingers resting on the cold glass. The cabin was still, save for the faint creak of wood and the soft snort of horses outside. Ethan had left early. She'd heard him saddling the mare just after dawn. The rhythmic sound of hooves moving away from the cabin had comforted her, somehow steady, reliable, like everything about the man. On the table lay a folded piece of cloth and a small bowl of warm water. Beside them, a note written in careful script. "You'll find soap in the tin by the stove. I'll be back before sundown. Don't try walking far yet." The handwriting was neat but heavy, as if each word had been pressed into the paper by thought, not habit. She traced the letters with her thumb and felt an ache that had nothing to do with her wounds. Outside, the sun climbed higher, touching the snow with gold. For the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, Clara dared to wash the dirt and dried blood from her feet. Each movement sent a sting through her soles, but the pain was clean now, purposeful. When she finished, she found herself studying her reflection in the metal basin, a stranger with hollow eyes, but steadier than before. She didn't know what would come next. She only knew she could breathe again. Later, as she tended the small fire, her thoughts wandered back to St. Louis, the streets of soot and clanging carriages, the smell of iron and rain. She remembered her husband, James, tall and kind, waving from the train the morning he left for the war. She remembered the telegram that came instead of him. The world had grown quiet after that. Years had passed in gray silence until that first letter arrived. She could still see the envelope, thick paper, black ink, a promise written in a stranger's hand. "You seem the kind of woman who knows how to keep a home. I am a man who knows how to keep his word." She'd read it over and over, late into the night, until hope began to sound like truth. Samuel Boone. That was the name he'd signed. A widower from the Montana Territory, seeking companionship, offering marriage. He'd written about a ranch near the river, a warm kitchen, and the piece of open land. He'd even sent money for the journey. It had all seemed so real, until the day she arrived in Ash Hollow. The man waiting for her wasn't the gentle writer of those letters. His eyes were hard and hungry. The cabin he led her to was half collapsed, his words colder than the wind that howled through its cracks. When she tried to leave, he laughed. That sound still echoed in her skull, jagged and cruel. She didn't know how she escaped that night, only that she ran until the stars blurred and the ground tore her feet apart. The door opened behind her, breaking the memory. Ethan stepped inside, dusted with snow, his gloves tucked under one arm. "You're up," he said, a faint smile under the shadow of his hat. "I tried not to sleep all day," Clara replied. Her voice was steadier now, less like a whisper. "That's a start," he said, setting down a small burlap sack. "Brought supplies from town. Some bread, a bit of salt pork. The Whitlocks sent honey. Said to tell you it's from their bees, not the store." She smiled faintly. "That's kind." "They're good folks," Ethan said, removing his hat. "Live over the ridge. If you need anything, Nora Whitlock's got more sense than most men in this valley. Then maybe I'll like her. I reckon you will." They shared a quiet laugh, soft and uncertain, but warm. As evening settled, the two of them sat by the fire again. Clara stitched a tear in her borrowed dress, while Ethan repaired a bridle, the leather creaking softly in his hands. "You said this place is called McGraw Ranch," she said after a while. He nodded. "My father started it. Died before I came back from the war. Guess I stayed because there wasn't anywhere else to go. Was your wife here too?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. The only sound was the fire snapping. Finally, he said, "She was past 10 winters back. Consumption. I'm sorry." He gave a small shrug. "It happens out here. The winters take what they want." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "You've been alone since then?" "Not entirely," he said, glancing toward the horses outside. "Got my stock. The land. Keeps a man busy enough not to think too much." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes thinking's the hardest work of all." He looked up then, and their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition. Maybe two people shaped by loss, both still standing. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the sharpness of it. Clara realized how long it had been since she'd felt safe enough to study another person's expression. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Do you ever wonder if the silence is all there'll ever be?" Ethan leaned back, his gaze distant. "Some days. But then the sun comes up, and the world looks different again. You learn to take that as enough." She nodded slowly. "Maybe that's all I can hope for, too. Maybe it's more than you think." The wind outside shifted, brushing against the cabin walls like a sigh. Clara looked at him and thought about what it meant to meet someone halfway, not just in distance, but in trust. She wasn't sure she could yet, but for the first time in years, she wanted to try. Ethan stood, stretched, and stoked the fire. "You should rest," he said. "Snow's deep tonight. Tomorrow. I'll show you the corral. Might be good to move a bit, if you're able." She smiled faintly. "You sound like a doctor." He grinned, just barely. "No, ma'am. Just a man who knows what happens when you stop moving." As he stepped toward the door, she called softly after him. Ethan. He paused. Thank you for finding me. He tipped his hat, his voice low. Didn't find you? Miss Hayes? You were already on the way. When he left, the door closed with a gentle thud. The sound stayed with her, like the steady beat of a heart in the quiet. Clara sat alone, staring into the fire, and thought about all the miles she'd run. Maybe, at last, her running had brought her somewhere she was meant to stop. Outside, snow began to fall again, softer this time, as if the land itself had decided to rest. By mid-morning the next day, the sun came up clear and sharp over the ridge. Snow glittered across the hills, hard and bright as glass. Clara stepped outside for the first time since the storm, wrapped in Ethan's old wool coat. The air burned her lungs, but it felt clean, and she drew it in deeply. The ranch spread wide around her fences, half buried in snow, a red barn leaning slightly against the wind, smoke curling from the chimney, chickens scratched at the frozen ground near the shed, and somewhere behind the barn, a horse whinnied. The sound startled her, rich and alive against the stillness. Ethan was already outside, pitching hay to the animals. He moved easily through the cold, his coat open at the collar, sleeves rolled up as if the winter meant nothing to him. When he saw her, he raised a hand in greeting but didn't call out. Words seemed unnecessary here. She made her way toward him, each step cautious on the frozen earth. You work early, she said, her voice soft, carried on the frost. Ranch doesn't care about the hour, he replied. Animals get hungry same time every day. He handed her a small fork and nodded toward the fence. If you feel up to it, help me spread some hay. Warmer work than just standing around. She took it, surprised at how natural the offer felt. Her hands trembled a little, unused to labor, but the motion steadied her. Together they worked in silence, tossing hay, breaking ice from the trough, the rhythm falling easy between them. From time to time, he glanced her way, just to be sure she wasn't tiring. She pretended not to notice. When they finished, he leaned against the fence, breathing hard but easy. You did fine, he said. Most folks from the city can't lift a fork right their first day. Clara smiled faintly. I used to help my father in his shop, she said. He was a blacksmith. I'd hand him nails and tools. Guess I learned not to mind a little heat or dirt. Ethan nodded approvingly. Then you'll do just fine out here. The day wore on with simple work. Ethan showed her the barn, where tools hung in perfect order. A saddle waited on the rail, oiled and ready. The smell of leather filled the air, mixed with the sweet scent of hay. He told her the horses' names, Dancer, Whiskey, Old Belle with her gray muzzle. Each one seemed to know his voice, watching him calm a restless mare. Clara felt something stir deep inside, not love, not yet, but the quiet sense that she was safe in his company. He spoke to the horse the same way he spoke to her, few words, steady tone, no demands. At noon, they sat on the porch, sharing bread and jerky. The silence stretched comfortably between them, broken only by the creak of wood and the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. Does it ever get lonely? She asked finally. He considered that for a while. Sometimes, but loneliness ain't always bad. Gives a man room to think. She nodded slowly. And what do you think about? He smiled, faint but real. Mostly how to keep the fences mended and the horses fed. Keeps me from thinking about things that can't be fixed. The honesty in his tone disarmed her. She realized then that he wasn't trying to impress her or fill the air with stories. He just spoke the truth, plain and quiet. Later, when she helped him carry wood inside, her foot slipped on the step. He caught her elbow before she fell. For a heartbeat they stood close, his gloved hand firm, her breath catching at the nearness. She murmured, "Thank you," and stepped back quickly. Ethan only nodded, as if the moment meant nothing. But his eyes lingered on her face a little longer than before. That evening, as the sun dropped low, the sky turned copper and violet over the plains. Clara helped prepare supper beans, bacon, and bread warmed by the fire. She wasn't much of a cook anymore. Years of eating alone had dulled the habit. Yet when Ethan tasted the beans and said quietly, "Best meal I've had in months," something inside her loosened. After they ate, he brought out a small tin lantern and motioned for her to follow. "There's something worth seeing," he said. They walked out beyond the barn, where the snow lay smooth and untouched. When he lifted the lantern, its glow revealed a frozen pond, the surface clear as glass, the moonlight scattered across it like silver coins. Clara caught her breath. "It's beautiful." Ethan's voice was low beside her. Most folks never notice it in winter, but when the ice clears like this, you can see the stars twice, once above and once below. She looked down, and indeed, the sky shimmered beneath their feet. For a moment, the world felt endless, heaven and earth folded into one. "I used to come here with my wife," Ethan said quietly. "She liked to watch the sky. Said it made the cold seem smaller." Clara turned to him. "Do you miss her?" He hesitated. "Every day. But missing don't mean stopping. You keep on, one step at a time." Her heart tightened at his words. She thought of her husband, long gone, and the years she'd spent waiting for something to make sense again. Maybe this was what survival looked like, not grand, not loud, just steady as breathing. They stood there until the lantern burned low. Neither spoke. The cold crept around them, but it wasn't sharp anymore. When they finally walked back, their footsteps fell in rhythm, the sound soft on the snow. Inside, Clara warmed her hands near the fire. Ethan poured them each a bit of coffee, dark and thin, but it tasted like comfort. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than the drink. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome, Miss Hayes. Rest easy tonight. Tomorrow. The storm's gone for good." She nodded, watching him move around the cabin, quiet and certain. When he blew out the lamp, darkness filled the room, not empty, but peaceful. Clara lay awake for a while, listening to the creak of the roof, the faint sound of horses shifting in their stalls. She thought about the pond, about the stars reflected in the ice. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that the worst might truly be behind her. And somewhere in that quiet, she whispered a prayer not for rescue, but for strength to stay. By the time spring began to stir beneath the crust of snow, Clara had found a rhythm in the days. Morning chores, the smell of hay, the quiet clatter of dishes by the stove. Her body had healed, though her feet still bore faint scars where the ice had bitten deep. Ethan never mentioned them, but every now and then she caught his gaze linger an unspoken acknowledgment of what she'd endured. She'd grown used to the silence of the plains, the way sound carried far and thin across the open air. Sometimes she would stand by the corral, watching the sky shift from gray to silver, and think she could almost hear her own heart again. On one of those mornings, a sound broke the calm, the distant echo of a rider approaching. Ethan looked up from the trough he was mending, squinting toward the ridge. "That'll be the mail rider," he said. "Comes through once a week if the river's not too high." The man arrived with dust on his coat and letters tucked in a leather pouch. He greeted Ethan, traded a few words about the road conditions, then handed him 2 envelopes before turning his horse and heading east. Ethan thumbed through the mail, then paused. "One's for me," he said, glancing at the second. "And this one's for a Miss Clara Hayes." Her stomach tightened. "For me? That's what it says." He held it out, the paper crisp and white against his rough fingers. Clara hesitated before taking it. The handwriting was unfamiliar sharp, businesslike, but the postmark from Ash Hollow sent a tremor through her chest. No one should have known she was here. Ethan watched her face. "Bad news." She forced a smile. "I'll read it inside." He nodded, though the furrow in his brow deepened. Inside the cabin. Clara broke the seal with trembling hands. The letter was short, written by the county sheriff. The words blurred as she read them aloud in a whisper. "Ma'am, a man by the name of Samuel Boone has been inquiring after you. Claims you're his lawful wife. Says you fled with his property and intends to press charges for theft and fraud. Advise caution until the matter is settled." The air left her lungs in one slow, burning breath. She sank into the chair, the paper shaking in her grip. Boone. He was still alive, still hunting. When Ethan stepped through the door a few minutes later, she tried to fold the letter, but her hands betrayed her. He stopped in the doorway, reading the fear on her face before he saw the paper. "Who's come looking for you?" he asked quietly. Clara swallowed. "A man I thought I left behind." He waited. She met his gaze and felt the strength in it calm, patient, unyielding. So she told him everything. How she had answered a newspaper ad for a widower seeking a wife. How Boone had written sweet words and sent her train fare. How his kindness had rotted the moment she stepped off the platform. The threats. The nights locked inside a cabin that smelled of whiskey and rage. The final flight into the storm. When she finished, the silence between them was heavy. Ethan took the letter from her hand, read it once, then set it on the table. "He's lying," he said simply. "I took his money," Clara whispered. "The fare he sent for the trip. Maybe that's what he means." Ethan shook his head. "A man doesn't buy a woman with postage. Whatever he sent, it wasn't yours to repay that way." Tears welled in her eyes. Not from fear this time, but from the simple mercy in his tone. "He'll come here, Ethan. He won't stop. Then we'll be ready. The way he said we steadied her, though she knew what danger it carried. Over the next few days, Ethan made quiet preparations. He rode into town, spoke with the sheriff himself, and returned with calm resolve. He's been seen near the river. He said, asked after you at the general store." Clara's stomach turned. "Then I should leave. I won't bring trouble to your door." Ethan leaned on the table, his eyes steady. "Running only gives him what he wants. You've done enough of that. I can't ask you to risk your life for me. You're not asking." He poured himself a cup of coffee, his voice low. "I've buried one good woman already. I won't stand by while another is hunted down." The words silenced her. There was no anger in them, only quiet conviction. That night, she sat by the fire, unable to rest. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, a steady reminder of how fragile the cabin truly was. She reached for her locket, feeling its weight against her palm. "James," she whispered to the husband she'd lost, "I thought I'd buried my heart with you. But this man, he makes it beat again, and now he might die for it." When she rose the next morning, Ethan was already outside. He had cleaned his rifle and saddled his horse. His movements were deliberate, without haste. "Are you going to town?" she asked. He nodded. "Sheriff says Boone's holed up near the old freight station. I'll talk to him." "Talk," she echoed. Ethan met her eyes. "Words first. Lead if I have to." Her breath caught. "Please, Ethan, don't go alone." He smiled faintly. "I've handled worse than a coward with a mouth. Stay here. Lock the door. If I'm not back by nightfall, ride to the Whitlocks." He turned before she could protest further. The sound of his horse faded down the valley until it was swallowed by the wind. All that day, Clara waited. She tried to keep busy mending a torn sleeve, feeding the fire, but the hours crawled. Every gust of wind felt like a warning, every creak of the roof like footsteps. By sundown, when the sky burned orange, she heard hooves again. She ran to the window just as Ethan rode in, his coat dusted with snow. Relief broke through her so fast it left her dizzy. When he stepped inside, she saw the cut across his cheek, thin and red. "He's gone," he said before she could ask. "Left town this morning, but he knows where we are." Clara's hands clenched at her sides. "He won't stop." Ethan met her gaze, firm. "Then neither will we." That night, they sat close by the fire, saying little. Outside, the wind had turned cold again, whispering along the eaves. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara didn't feel like a guest. She felt like someone standing her ground. The evening after Ethan returned from town, the air at McGraw Ranch felt heavier, as though the hills themselves were listening. Clouds drifted low, hiding the peaks. Inside the cabin, the fire burned brighter than usual, and the soft hum of wind against the shutters made every sound intimate. Clara stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She'd found carrots and potatoes in the cellar, a jar of dried herbs tucked behind sacks of grain. The scent filled the small room, warm and earthy. It reminded her of simpler times of dinners long ago, laughter that hadn't yet been stolen by grief. Ethan sat at the table, cleaning a lantern with a rag. His hands moved slow, deliberate, the same way he spoke. The small cut on his cheek had begun to scab, and the skin beneath his eyes looked shadowed from lack of sleep. "You should rest," she said softly. "You've been up since dawn." He looked up, a faint smile crossing his face. "Can't rest till the chores are done. You finished them an hour ago." He chuckled under his breath. "Then maybe I forgot how to stop." Clara poured stew in 2 bowls, setting one in front of him. The firelight caught the steam rising between them, and for a moment, the world outside seemed far away. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the crackle of wood. Then Ethan spoke. "You make a fine meal. Miss Hayes?" She shook her head lightly. "It's the fire that did most of the work." He studied her face, the way the lamplight softened her features. "You don't talk much about what you want next." Clara looked down at her bowl. "I don't know what's left to want. Living's a start," he said. She smiled faintly. "You make it sound simple." "It ain't," he admitted. "But simple and easy aren't the same thing." His words lingered in the quiet, sinking into her like warmth after a long cold. After supper, she washed the dishes while he went to check the barn. Through the open door, she watched him walk into the fading light, his silhouette framed against the snow. Something about the sight, one man against all that open land, filled her with both peace and fear. Peace, because he belonged there. Fear, because she might not. When he came back, she'd already lit the lamp on the table. Its glow painted the room in soft gold. "The Whitlocks sent over some preserves," he said, setting a small jar by her elbow. "They said they'd like you to visit Sunday, if you're feeling up to it." Clara hesitated. "I don't know if that's wise," with Boone still nearby. Ethan leaned on the table, his expression calm. "You can't let one man take every mile of this country from you. Fear's just another kind of prison." His words settled heavy but true. She wanted to believe them. Later that night, Nora Whitlock herself arrived at the door, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. She was a round, cheerful woman in her 40s, wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of lavender. "I heard we've got company staying with Ethan," she said with a smile. "Thought I'd see for myself." Ethan laughed softly. "Nora, you've never needed an excuse for gossip." Clara smiled despite herself. Nora's warmth was infectious. They shared tea while Ethan stoked the fire. Nora asked about St. Louis, about life in the city, and Clara found herself answering cautiously at first, then more freely. Talking about her past no longer felt like picking at an open wound. It felt like letting air reach a scar. When Nora finally rose to leave, she touched Clara's hand gently. "You've been through a hard road," she said, "but don't let it make you forget who you are. Out here, we build new names when the old ones break." Clara stood by the door long after she left, the words echoing in her mind. Later, as the fire burned low, Ethan sat beside her. He had taken off his boots, his feet propped near the hearth. The smell of smoke and pine filled the room. "She's right," he said quietly. "This land gives more than it takes, if you stay long enough to see it." Clara turned to him. "Did it give you peace?" He was silent a moment. "Not at first. I tried to fill the quiet with work. Thought if I mended enough fences, fixed enough things, I'd stop missing her. Your wife." He nodded. "She was gentle, laughed at the wrong times, burned every loaf of bread she touched. But when the sickness came, she never complained. Just asked me to promise one thing to keep living." His voice faltered, low and rough. "I told her I would. Took me 10 years to mean it." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." He glanced at her, the corners of his mouth softening. "Don't be. You remind me what keeping that promise looks like." She didn't know how to answer, so she just nodded. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with something unspoken, like two souls learning to breathe the same air. The next morning dawned pale and still. A thin layer of frost glittered on the window pane. Clara woke early, unable to shake the unease that had crept in overnight. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, her breath rising in white curls, down the slope. She saw movement near the tree line, a rider, small in the distance, watching. When she blinked, the figure was gone, but the unease stayed. At breakfast, she told Ethan what she'd seen. "Could have been a hunter," he said, but his tone had tightened. "I don't think so. He was still, waiting." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we stay alert." He didn't mention Boone's name, but they both felt it. By evening, the air had turned bitter. Ethan double-bolted the door before sitting across from her at the table. The lamplight trembled faintly, casting long shadows on the walls. Boone might try to use the law, he said. "He's a talker, and men like that find ways to twist truth. But I spoke to the sheriff. He's not fooled." Clara nodded. "Still, he'll come?" "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "He will." Their eyes met across the table, steady and unafraid. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls. But inside there was warmth, a kind of defiance, born not from anger, but from knowing they were no longer alone. That night, as she lay in the dim glow of the dying fire, Clara thought of what Nora had said, that people out here built new names when the old ones broke. Maybe that was true. Maybe in time she could build one too. And as sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed not of running, but of standing still beside a man who had learned to keep his promises, and a land vast enough to hold both their scars. The next few weeks passed in a quiet rhythm. The thaw came slow that year, and every morning the valley steamed under the early sun. The river cracked its ice with a sound like thunder rolling through stone. Clara spent her days mending linens and tending the small garden behind the cabin, where the first shoots of green were brave enough to rise. For a while, life felt almost ordinary, but the peace didn't hold. It began with small things a fence post cut clean through, hoof prints circling the corral at night. Then the dogs started barking at nothing, their cries sharp and frightened. Ethan said, "Coyotes." Clara wanted to believe him, but she had seen the shape once herself, a man on horseback watching from the far ridge, motionless in the fading light, his hat pulled low, his shoulders broad. He sat the saddle like someone who believed the land belonged to him. Boone. She didn't need to see his face to know. That night, she sat by the fire, turning the locket in her hands until her thumb ached. The storm outside whispered against the windows. Ethan came in from checking the barn, his coat soaked at the edges, and saw the fear she couldn't quite hide. "He's closer, isn't he?" Ethan asked quietly. She nodded. "I saw him again, at sunset." He removed his gloves and set them by the stove. "Then it's time we stop waiting." Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean? I mean, we tell the town," Ethan said. "Boone's made his story sound clean. But once folks see what he's after, they'll stand with us. The Whitlocks, Sheriff Keller, they've got more backbone than he figures." "Will they believe me?" she asked. Her voice was small. A woman who ran from her husband, with no proof except scars Ethan's gaze softened. "They'll believe me." Something in his tone left no room for doubt. The next morning, they rode together into Ash Hollow. The trail cut through hills speckled with wild sage, the sky wide and pale as bone. Clara rode the gentlest mare, Belle, wrapped in Ethan's spare coat. Her heart pounded with every mile. She hadn't been near the town since she fled the station months before. As they descended the ridge, she saw the first rooftops, tin and wood, smoke rising from chimneys. The faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer carried through the air. It could have been any small town in America, except that her fear had stained it with memory. When they reached the sheriff's office, Keller greeted Ethan with a nod. He was a thick man, with a gray beard and a calm, watchful look. Heard Boone's name floating around. He said, "Can't say I like the smell of it." Ethan leaned on the counter. "He's been on my land, watching. I'd like it known that Miss Hayes is under my protection, and that Boone's not to come near her." Keller's eyes shifted to Clara. "You're the lady from St. Louis?" "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "And I'm not his wife. Whatever he tells you." The sheriff nodded once. "Word is, he's telling folks you stole from him." Clara's hands trembled at her sides. "The only thing I took was my life." Keller studied her face, then turned to Ethan. "If Boone shows in town, I'll hold him till we sort this out. You got my word." "Appreciate it," Ethan said. They left the office as the sun began to dip, painting the street in long shadows. People passed by with cautious glances, whispers following them. Clara felt the weight of it, but also something new defiance. She was done hiding. At the general store, Nora Whitlock met them at the door. "He's here," she said in a low voice. "Boone. Came in an hour ago, asking after a woman with brown hair and a scar on her cheek." Clara froze. Ethan's hand moved gently to her back. "Where is he now?" Nora pointed toward the saloon at the end of the street. "Drinking. Boasting loud enough for the walls to blush. Go home." "Nora," Ethan said, "and bolt your doors." "I'll do that," she said, but her eyes flicked to Clara. "Be careful, both of you." As they walked down the street, Clara's legs felt heavy. The wooden planks creaked under their boots, the smell of whiskey spilling from the saloon door. Through the window, she saw him, Samuel Boone. He hadn't changed much. His beard was thicker, his eyes the same sharp yellow-brown. He laughed at something a man said, slapping the table with a hand that once left bruises across her skin. The sight made her heart slam against her ribs. Ethan's voice was quiet. "Stay here." "No," Clara whispered. "He needs to see. I'm not afraid anymore." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Together they stepped inside. The noise dimmed as soon as they crossed the threshold. Boone turned slowly, a sneer curling his mouth. "Well, I'll be damned. My runaway bride." Clara didn't flinch. "You're no husband of mine." He stood, towering, the smell of liquor heavy on him. "You ran with my money, my name. You think hiding behind this old cowboy makes you clean?" Ethan took one step forward. "Watch your mouth." "Boone." Boone laughed, a dry, cruel sound. "What's this? McGraw. You her savior now. You don't know the half of her." Ethan's voice stayed calm. "I know enough. You're done here." Boone's hand twitched toward his belt, but the sheriff's voice cut through from the doorway. "Easy, gentlemen." Keller had followed them in, rifle in hand. "Nobody's dying in my town tonight." Boone hesitated, then spat on the floor. "This ain't over." Keller stepped forward. "Maybe it is. You're under arrest for harassment and trespass. You can tell your story to the judge if you've got one worth hearing." 2 deputies moved in. Boone's glare burned as they let him out. "She'll ruin you two." "McGraw," he hissed. "That's what she does. She ruins men." The saloon went silent. Ethan didn't answer. He only looked at Clara, his eyes steady. And in that silence, every lie Boone had ever told seemed to collapse under its own weight. When they stepped outside, the sun was gone, and the stars were just beginning to bloom above the ridge. Clara breathed deep, the air cold and sharp. "He'll come back," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Maybe. But next time, he won't find you running." She met his gaze and felt something shift to strength she hadn't known she still possessed. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the space between one heartbeat and the next, waiting to be filled. For a few days after Boone's arrest, Ash Hollow breathed easier. The gossip quieted, and the sheriff assured Ethan that Boone would be held until his case could be sent before the circuit judge. Yet Clara felt no peace. She had seen too much of Boone's cunning to trust a lock and key. A man like him didn't stop until he had broken something or someone. Ethan tried to keep the ranch moving. The calves needed tending, fences mended, fields plowed. He moved through his work with a kind of quiet strength that steadied her, but she saw the tension in his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Ethan found her standing by the corral, watching the horizon darken. "You're thinking again," he said gently. I can't seem to stop," she admitted. He rested one arm on the rail beside her. "You don't have to. Thinking's fine. It's fearing that tires the soul." Clara looked up at him. "How do you stop fearing something that never truly leaves?" He considered that. "You don't. You just learn to live bigger than it." His words stayed with her through the night. She dreamed of running through snow again, of hands reaching out, of Ethan's voice calling her name from somewhere she couldn't see. When she woke, the dawn was red, the kind of red that never meant a gentle day. By noon, word came from town. Boone had escaped. Ethan found her in the barn, brushing Belle's mane. His face was pale, his voice low. "Keller sent a rider. Boone's gone. 2 nights ago. A guard turned up drunk, and the cell was empty by morning." Clara froze, her hand still on the horse's neck. "He's coming here." Ethan nodded once. Likely. The fear she'd tried to bury rose again, thick and suffocating. "You should send me away." "Ethan, if he finds me here, I'm not sending you anywhere," he said firmly. "This is your home now." Something in his voice broke her resolve. She turned away, tears burning her eyes. "You don't understand what he's capable of." Ethan stepped closer, resting a calloused hand on her shoulder. "And you don't understand what I'd do to keep you safe." The words silenced her. She could feel his heart beating steady against her back. And for the first time in her life, fear and safety lived side by side in the same breath. That night, the air felt strange, thick, electric. The sky had turned copper at sunset, and the wind blew hot from the south. Ethan double-checked the doors, the shutters, the rifle by the stove. Clara sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. "Try to rest," he said. She shook her head. "He's out there. I can feel it." Ethan crouched beside her, his eyes level with hers. "If he comes, he'll find I'm not the kind of man he can scare." Before she could answer, the dogs outside began barking sharp, frantic. Ethan stood in an instant, rifle in hand. "Stay here." Clara's heart hammered as he stepped out into the dark. Through the small window, she could see only flickering shadows. Then light, a faint orange glow to the east, rising fast. "Fire!" "Ethan!" she cried, rushing to the door. He turned, eyes wide. "He's burning the field." They ran together into the night. The wind whipped hot against their faces, carrying embers that stung the skin. The dry grass crackled underfoot as flames climbed toward the fence line. Ethan threw off his coat, beating at the fire with a wet burlap sack. Clara joined him, choking on smoke, her hair plastered to her face. "Go back," he shouted over the roar. "No," she coughed, her voice raw. "Not this time." For a moment, they fought side by side, the heat fierce and blinding. Then through the haze, she saw him, Boone, emerging from the tree line, his outline black against the firelight. "Ethan!" she screamed. Boone moved fast, a pistol glinting in his hand. Ethan turned, the fire lighting his face in flashes of red and gold. The 2 men locked eyes, 10 years of rage and grief crashing together in silence. "Step away from her," Boone snarled. Ethan didn't move. "You've done enough." Boone's laugh was jagged. "You think she loves you? She'll ruin you, like she ruined me." Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling, but clear. "You ruined yourself. Boone." He swung the gun toward her. "You belong to me." Ethan moved then faster than she could see. The rifle cracked once. Boone staggered, his face twisting in disbelief, and fell backward into the burning grass. The flames swallowed him before the echo of the shot died. The world went still, except for the hiss of fire. Clara stood frozen, her hands shaking. The smell of smoke and gunpowder thick in the air. Ethan reached for her, pulling her close. "It's over," he whispered. "It's done." She buried her face against his chest, the sobs breaking free at last. The fire spread low across the ridge, painting the sky in orange waves, but the worst of it had passed. Together, they watched as the flames burned down to embers. By dawn, the sheriff's men arrived to find what remained a body charred beyond recognition, a field blackened but not destroyed, and two people standing side by side, smoke-stained and silent. Keller took one look at their faces and said nothing. When he left, Clara and Ethan walked back toward the cabin. The air smelled of ash and rain. Neither spoke until they reached the porch. "I didn't want him to die," Clara said softly. "I know." Ethan rested his hand on hers. "But he would have taken everything from you if he could." She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Then maybe the fire took what needed burning. He looked at her, eyes tired but gentle. "You've got nothing left to run from, Clara." For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she reached for his hand. "Then maybe it's time to learn how to stay." They stood together as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke out toward the river. In the distance, the first light of morning brushed the charred hills, soft and golden, like forgiveness. When the smoke finally cleared, a strange stillness settled over McGraw Ranch. The land, though scorched and scarred, breathed again. The birds came back first, cautious, darting low over the blackened fields as if testing whether the world had truly survived the night. Clara stood on the porch in the pale dawn, wrapped in Ethan's coat. The air still carried the faint, bitter tang of ash. Behind her, inside the cabin, Ethan slept for the first time in nearly 2 days. His arm had a small burn where the flames had licked him, but otherwise he was whole. She had sat by his side until the trembling in her hands finally eased. Now she watched the land that had nearly swallowed them both and felt a strange gratitude. The earth was wounded, yes, but it was alive, just like her. When Ethan came outside, his voice was soft. "I thought I'd find you here." "I couldn't sleep," she said. "It's too quiet." He stepped beside her, resting his hand on the porch rail. The boards were warm from the morning sun. "Quiet can be good. Sometimes." She nodded slowly. "It's just, after all that noise, the silence feels too big." Ethan looked out across the blackened ridge. "Fire takes what it wants, but it makes room for what's next." "What's next?" she echoed. The words felt foreign on her tongue. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "That's up to you now, Clara." They spent the morning walking the property, surveying the damage. The barn still stood, though one side of the roof had charred. The corral fence was half gone. The pasture near the creek had burned to bare soil, the air still warm enough to shimmer. Clara helped gather what could be saved tools, rope, bits of scorched wood for kindling. The work steadied her. Each movement was a small act of defiance, proof that she could build again. By midday, Nora Whitlock arrived with a wagon full of supplies. Her husband, Frank, drove the team, his face set in grim concern. "Sheriff told us what happened," Nora said. "Climbing down. Lord have mercy. Clara, we thought we'd lost you both." Clara hugged her, the smell of lavender soap and wood smoke filling her senses. "We almost did." Nora looked around at the charred fields. "Boone's gone." Then Clara nodded. "Gone." Nora touched her cheek gently. "Then it's time to live." "Sweetheart, Time to let yourself be something other than what he made you. Those words stayed with her through the afternoon, while Ethan and Frank repaired the fence. Clara helped Nora hang wet sheets to dry, the white fabric fluttering like small flags of surrender. For the first time in years, laughter came easy, quiet, unforced. Later, when the Whitlocks left, Ethan stood by the gate, watching their wagon disappear into the valley. "Good folks," he said. "They are," Clara agreed. "The kind that remind you why people stay here." He glanced at her, a half-smile on his lips. "You thinking of staying?" She hesitated. "I don't know yet. You don't have to decide now. I'm not sure I ever learned how to stop running long enough to decide anything." Ethan's smile faded. "Then maybe this is where you learn." That night, the air was clear again, the stars sharp as nails against the black sky. They ate supper on the porch beans, biscuits, and coffee, simple and satisfying. The land stretched quiet around them, and for the first time in months, Clara didn't feel the weight of eyes watching her. "I keep expecting to wake up and find it all gone," she said softly. "It's not a dream," Ethan replied, "though some days I wish it were." She turned to him. "You mean the fire?" He shook his head. "No, the years before it." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. "You lost more than your wife, didn't you?" He looked down, fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "I lost myself for a while. After she passed, I just stopped being a person, became part of the land instead. It was easier to mend fences than hearts." Clara's eyes stung, and now he met her gaze. "Now I'm starting to remember what being alive feels like." The words hung between them, quiet and raw. She looked away, out toward the dark fields. "I don't know if I can give you anything more than this moment. That's enough," he said simply. They sat together in silence, listening to the night, the soft hum of crickets, the distant low of cattle, the gentle creak of the porch. All of it seemed to say the same thing: "You're still here." The following week brought rain, gentle, steady, washing the last traces of soot from the earth. Green began to show through black, stubborn and bright. Clara spent her mornings planting new seed with Ethan. They worked side by side, their hands meeting in the soil. The rhythm of it reminded her of something holy. One afternoon, as they rested by the fence, she said quietly, "I thought love was supposed to be loud, something that burned and consumed. But maybe it's this instead." Ethan wiped his brow. "What's that?" "Something that grows where the fire's already been." He smiled. "Then I reckon we've got good ground for it." Days stretched into weeks. The grass returned. The horses fattened. The cabin filled again with small ordinary sounds: the scrape of chairs, the thud of boots, the laughter of neighbors who came to help rebuild. Life didn't rush back all at once. It crept in, slow and sure. One evening, as the last of the sun melted behind the hills, Clara brought out 2 chairs and set them facing the horizon. "You said fire makes room for what's next," she reminded him. Ethan nodded, and she looked at him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Then maybe what's next is us." He said nothing, only reached out and took her hand. The gesture was small, but it felt like a promise made to the earth itself. The wind carried the scent of rain and wild sage. Above them, a hawk circled high, silent and sure. The land stretched wide and golden, a testament to everything that had survived. Clara leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. For the first time since the war had taken her husband, since Boone had taken her freedom, She felt something like peace, a quiet, steady flame that no storm could put out. By the time autumn deepened, the world around McGraw Ranch had changed. The grass that grew back after the fire was thicker, almost defiant. Wildflowers bloomed where the ash had once clung to the soil. Each morning, the fog came in low and soft, curling like smoke along the valley floor, and the air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. Clara had changed too. Her face had color again. Her hair no longer hung limp around her shoulders. She laughed more, though softly, as if testing the sound of her own joy. The nightmares came less often now. Sometimes she would wake to the rustle of the wind through the shutters and feel only calm. Ethan noticed the difference but said nothing. He worked the land beside her, fixing fences, driving cattle, splitting wood for the winter ahead. There was peace in their routine, unspoken, steady. One crisp morning, as Clara went to fetch water from the well, she noticed something wedged between the boards of the porch rail. A letter, folded and sealed with dark wax. Her breath caught. She glanced toward the pasture. Ethan was far off, herding a pair of strays, and opened it slowly. The handwriting was careful but unfamiliar. Mrs. Hayes, it began. We've settled the matter of Samuel Boone's estate. There will be no further claims against your name. He'd left no kin, no debts beyond his own making. You are free to go wherever you wish. The Lord grant you peace. It was signed, simply, Sheriff Keller. She stood there for a long while, the words trembling in her hands. Free to go wherever you wish. For years, she had dreamed of those words, dreamed of escape, of distance, of some imagined place where fear couldn't reach her. But now, as she looked out across the land that had sheltered her, she realized she no longer wanted to go anywhere at all. When Ethan came back, she handed him the letter without a word. He read it, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket. You're free now, he said quietly. I suppose I am. He studied her face, his eyes gentle. That scare you? Clara smiled faintly. A little. I don't know who I am without something to run from. Then maybe it's time you learn who you are when you stay. His words struck deep. That evening, she walked down to the river. The air shimmered gold through the cottonwoods, and the sound of the water was low and steady. She knelt on the bank and let her hand drift into the current. The cold bit at her skin, grounding her in the moment. She thought of everything the river had seen, the firelight reflecting on its surface, the blood, the tears, the quiet mornings afterward. She thought of James, her first husband, who had gone off to war and never returned. She thought of Boone, who had tried to claim her with cruelty and had died for it. And she thought of Ethan, who had never tried to own her at all, only to stand beside her. She unlatched the locket from her neck, the one that held James's faded photograph, and stared at it under the fading light. Then, slowly, she opened her fingers. The locket slipped from her hand and vanished into the water with barely a sound. When she rose, her heart felt lighter. She found Ethan waiting at the edge of the field, his hat in his hands. Thought I'd come see if you were all right, he said. I am, she answered, for the first time in a long while. He nodded, a slow smile touching his lips. Then I reckon the river did its work. They walked back to the house together, the sky deepening from gold to violet. A chill crept into the air, and Ethan shrugged off his coat, draping it around her shoulders. She didn't protest this time. Inside, The cabin glowed warm with lamplight. The smell of stew filled the air, and the fire crackled in the hearth. Clara paused by the doorway, looking around at the simple space that had once been strange to her. Now it felt like home. She turned to him. "You ever think about what comes next?" Ethan leaned his rifle against the wall. "Every day, but I stopped trying to plan it too far ahead. Life's like this land. It gives what it wants, when it's ready. And what do you want?" He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "Peace, maybe company, maybe you." The honesty of it made her throat tighten. She crossed the room slowly, her step sure. When she reached him, she placed a hand on his chest. "Then maybe you've already got it," she whispered. For a while, they just stood there, no words, no grand gestures, only the sound of the fire and the faint whistle of wind through the chinks in the walls. Two people who had lost nearly everything, now standing in the quiet miracle of what remained. That night, she dreamed again of the river, but differently. No longer running, just standing at its edge, watching the water carry the past downstream. When she woke, the first light of dawn spilled across the room, and she smiled. The next day, they rode into town together to deliver a wagon of lumber to the Whitlocks. Nora met them with her usual bright energy. "Well now," she said, grinning at Clara, "you look different." Clara laughed softly. "I feel different. That's what happens when you let the world stop chasing you," Nora said. "It has to find someone else to bother." They spent the day helping Frank repair a roof beam. When the work was done, Nora pressed a jar of honey into Clara's hands. "For sweet days ahead," she said. On the ride home, the air smelled of sage and rain. The world felt wide, but not empty. Ethan glanced over at her. "You sure you want to stay through the winter? I've had enough winters alone," she replied. He nodded once, and that was the end of it. That night, as the fire burned low, Clara took out a blank piece of paper and began to write. She didn't know who the letter was, perhaps for herself, perhaps for the woman she used to be. "I am not the same." She wrote, "The road that brought me here was made of pain and ash, but it led to light. Love doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes like dawn, quiet, certain, and slow." When she finished, she folded the paper and tucked it into a small wooden box beside the bed. A keepsake, a beginning, outside. The river whispered under the stars, endless and calm. The land slept, and for once, so did she, dreamless, unafraid. By the time the first snow fell, the ranch was ready for it. The roofs were patched, the fences mended, the horses thick with winter coats. Clara stood at the doorway one morning, wrapped in a shawl, watching the flakes drift down. They came slow and soft, settling over the hills like a blessing. Winter had always frightened her before. In St. Louis, it meant long nights and memories that refused to stay buried. But here, the silence felt different. It wasn't emptiness, it was peace. Inside, Ethan was splitting wood by the fire. His movements were steady, the rhythm of a man who had spent his life working against the cold. "Storm's coming," he said without looking up. "You can smell it in the air." Clara smiled faintly. "You can smell everything in this country. The wind, the horses, the rain. It's like the land keeps its own secrets." He straightened, setting another log on the pile. "It does, but it shares them with those who stay long enough to listen." She loved that about him, the way he spoke as if the earth were an old friend. She'd begun to understand what he meant. Every sound out here had meaning: the cry of a hawk, the crack of ice on the river, even the creak of the cabin timbers on cold nights. It was a language of endurance. That afternoon, they prepared for the storm. Clara filled jars with dried beans and flour, helped cover the barn windows, and brought the chickens inside the coop. When the snow began to fall, in earnest, they were ready. As the wind howled through the valley, Ethan lit an oil lamp and set it on the table. "We'll be snowed in a few days," he said. "Just you, me, and the fire." Clara laughed softly. "Sounds almost nice." "It is, if you don't mind my cooking." "I've survived worse," she teased, and he grinned. They ate supper by the fire bread, salt pork, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The warmth of the flames glowed against the window, where snowflakes spun like stars. Outside, the world disappeared into white. When the wind quieted for a moment, Clara looked up. "It feels strange," she said. "Being safe." Ethan's expression softened. "Strange is good. Means you're learning it?" She smiled. "And you? Do you ever stop missing her, your wife?" He was silent for a long moment. "I still talk to her sometimes," he admitted, "when the night's too long. But it's not sorrow anymore. It's remembering without pain. I hope I can learn that," she said quietly. "You already are." He replied, "Later." When they turned in, the storm deepened. The cabin shook. The wind moaned in the chimney. Yet somehow, the sound didn't frighten her. She lay awake listening to it, feeling Ethan's presence nearby, a steady warmth in the dark. In the morning, the world outside was buried. The snow lay 3 feet deep, glinting like powdered glass under the pale sun. Ethan shoveled a path to the barn while Clara cooked breakfast. The smell of biscuits filled the cabin, mingling with wood smoke. When he came back inside, snow in his beard and hair, she couldn't help but laugh. "You look like you've aged 20 years. He wiped his face with a towel, smiling. "I'll take that as wisdom, not wear." She handed him a plate. "Then you'll need wisdom to keep warm today." They spent the morning side by side, she mending an old quilt, he carving a new handle for the spade. From time to time, their eyes met and lingered. No rush, no fear, just the quiet knowledge of belonging. By evening, the storm had eased. The clouds broke, revealing a sky washed clean. The world outside shimmered under moonlight, still and untouched. "Come with me," Ethan said suddenly, pulling on his coat. Clara hesitated. "Where you'll see?" She followed him into the snow. The air was so cold it stung her lungs, but the sight ahead stole her breath altogether. The pond, the same one he'd shown her in winter months before, was frozen again, clear as glass. The moon reflected off it perfectly, the stars doubling beneath their feet. "It's like the world's holding its breath," she whispered. Ethan took her hand. "You once said silence scared you. Does it still?" She shook her head slowly. "Not anymore. Now it feels like peace." They stood together, watching the sky reflected in the ice. For a long moment, neither spoke. The land stretched around them, vast and silver, a cathedral made of light and frost. When they returned to the cabin, Clara poured 2 cups of coffee. "I think I understand what you meant," she said softly, "about listening to the land. It tells you when it's time to stop running." Ethan smiled. "And what's it telling you now that maybe I've arrived?" He reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "Then welcome home." Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, steady, unhurried. It whispered against the windows, soft as breath. The fire burned low. The lamplight flickered, and in that small cabin in the middle of the Montana winter, Clara Hayes finally let herself believe she belonged to something again. By March, the snow began to melt, slow as forgiveness. Thin rivulets ran down from the hills, carving new paths through the black soil. The world smelled of wet pine and promise. Each morning, the sunlight came earlier, spreading across the valley in long, gold bands that seemed to touch every scar the land carried and every scar Clara carried too. She had lived through one full winter at McGraw Ranch. The days of silence no longer felt heavy. They were a kind of music now, measured and steady. Every creak of the wood, every call of the meadowlark had its place. That morning, Ethan was already outside when she woke. She found him by the barn, sleeves rolled up, the steam from his breath rising in the cool air. He was repairing the wagon wheel that had split during the storm. His movements were easy, confident. He hummed softly as he worked. "You sing now," she teased, leaning against the post. He glanced over, grinning. "Only when no one's supposed to be listening. Too late for that." He chuckled. "Then I'll have to practice more." They shared breakfast on the porch, a habit that had become theirs. The world still slept under patches of snow, but the air already hinted of green things waiting below. Clara sipped her coffee and looked out across the fields. "It's hard to believe all this burned," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Fire's got a cruel way of giving life back. You just have to live long enough to see it." She smiled, her eyes soft. "I suppose that's true for people, too." They spent the day tending to the animals, mending fences that had buckled under the frost. Clara found herself laughing more often, her voice bright in the open air. She didn't recognize it at first, the sound of joy unguarded. It startled her, then warmed her. Later, as the afternoon stretched into gold, she and Ethan sat by the riverbank, watching the water move faster with the thaw. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. He skimmed a stone across the surface. "Every season's got its own work. Spring means planting, summer means tending, and after that, we see what grows." Clara smiled. "You always talk like the land is a mirror." He shrugged. "Maybe it is. Shows you what you give it and what you still hide." She was quiet for a long time. "When I came here, I didn't think I had anything left to give." He looked at her then, his expression gentle. "You've been giving since the day you walked through that door. You just didn't see it yet." The words caught her off guard. "What do you mean you brought laughter back to this place?" he said simply. "Brought light? You turned a house into a home again." Clara blinked against the sudden sting of tears. "You make it sound easy. It never is," he replied. "But worth it. Always." The sun dipped low, painting the river in hues of copper and rose. The first geese of the season passed overhead, calling as they flew north. The sound carried far and wide, ancient and certain. That night, after supper, Clara pulled an old book from the shelf, one she'd found tucked behind Ethan's tools weeks earlier. It was a small volume of poems, worn at the spine. "You read these?" she asked as he poured 2 cups of coffee. "Now and then," he said. "My wife used to read them aloud. Said words were another kind of music." She turned a page and began reading softly. "The heart that once was torn may still be tender, but in the quiet earth, roots find their way. What breaks does not always end. Sometimes it begins again." When she finished, the silence that followed was full of something sacred. Ethan's eyes were on her, the firelight flickering in their depths. "That one was her favorite," he said quietly. Clara closed the book and smiled. Then she had good taste. The days grew longer after that. They planted together rows of corn, beans, and early potatoes. The soil was rich, dark, forgiving. Each seed she pressed into the earth felt like a promise. She began to think that maybe life was not about forgetting the past, but about growing through it. On a warm afternoon in late April, Nora Whitlock arrived in her wagon, cheeks flushed and voice full of cheer. "You two look healthy enough to put me out of business," she declared. "I brought fresh bread and some jam. You'll need it after all this work." Clara hugged her tightly. "It's good to see you." "Nora." "Good to see you," Nora said, eyeing her knowingly. "You've got that look about you like a woman who's stopped looking backward." Clara laughed softly, maybe because I finally found something worth looking toward. When Nora left, the air smelled of lilac and new grass. Ethan stood beside Clara, watching the wagon disappear over the ridge. "She's right, you know," he said. "You've changed." "So have you," Clara replied. "You smile more." He grinned. "Guess I've got reason to." Evening fell slow and sweet. They sat on the porch again, a quilt over their knees, the stars sharp in the clear sky. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think it'll last," she murmured. "What's that?" "This peace." He took a breath. "Peace isn't something that lasts. It's something you choose, over and over, every day." She nodded, understanding. "Then I'll keep choosing it." For a while. They listened to the night, the soft hum of crickets, the faint rush of the river, the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to rest. The land had healed, and so had they. "When the moon climbed high," Clara whispered, "do you ever wonder why we found each other? Out of all the people in the world." Ethan's voice was low and sure. Maybe we were both just walking toward the same kind of quiet. She smiled and met halfway. By the time summer came, the valley around McGraw Ranch was alive again. The fields rolled green and gold beneath a sky so wide it could swallow every sorrow. Wildflowers blue lupine, yellow balsam root, and red Indian paintbrush spread like spilled color across the hills. The air shimmered with heat and the hum of bees. Clara woke early most mornings, rising with the sun. She'd step onto the porch barefoot, coffee in hand, watching the light climb the ridges. Sometimes Ethan would already be out there, fixing a harness or sharpening a blade. Other mornings he'd just stand beside her, quiet, his presence enough. That summer, the ranch felt different, not merely alive, but whole. The horses were strong, the garden thick with tomatoes and herbs. The land had forgiven them for the fire, and maybe finally she had forgiven herself too. One warm afternoon, she and Ethan rode out to the upper meadow. The air was heavy with the scent of clover, the sound of water rushing faintly from the creek below. They dismounted beneath a stand of aspens, their white trunks shimmering in the sun. Ethan spread a blanket, setting down a small basket he'd carried tied to his saddle. "Brought lunch," he said. "You packed it yourself," she teased. "Mostly," he said, grinning. "Nora gave me advice. Said not to let you think I forgot the honey." Clara laughed. "She's always watching out for you." "She's watching out for us," he corrected. They ate in the grass, bread and cold chicken, with wild strawberries for dessert. The world around them hummed softly wind. Bees, the distant call of a hawk. Clara leaned back, the sunlight painting her face warm. "I used to think peace was something people earned," she said, "like a prize at the end of a long road." And now Ethan asked, "Now I think it's something you grow into, slowly, like the land after winter." Ethan nodded. That sounds about right. A silence settled between them, easy and full. Then he spoke again, softer this time. Clara, I've been thinking. This house, this land, it's more than I can handle, alone. Always has been. But I don't want to give it up. Not now. She turned to him, her heart already stirring. What are you saying? He smiled, a little shy. I'm saying I'd like you to stay here. Not as a guest. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this place feels like it's yours too. Her breath caught. Ethan. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. I don't have fancy words for it. You already know what's in my heart. I just want you here, for as long as the world lets us. Tears welled in her eyes, unexpected and tender. You've already given me more than I ever hoped for. Then let me give you one more thing, he said quietly. He stood and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small wooden box plane, carved by hand. Inside lay a simple silver ring, thin and shining in the sunlight. It was my mother's, he said. I think she'd have liked you. Clara covered her mouth, the tears slipping free. For a long moment she couldn't speak. Then, with trembling fingers, she took the ring. Ethan McGraw, she whispered, you've already met me halfway. I'm not about to stop walking now. He smiled a quiet, sure smile and slipped the ring onto her finger. The wind moved through the grass around them, whispering like an old song. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the ridge, low and warm, like the world's slow heartbeat. That evening, when they returned to the ranch, the sky opened with a light rain. They left the horses sheltered and stood on the porch, watching the storm pass over the valley. The smell of wet sage filled the air. Ethan looked out toward the horizon. You ever think about how much this land's seen the fires, the storms, all the seasons, and still it grows back? Clara leaned against him. Maybe that's what love is, something that grows back, no matter what's been burned. He looked down at her, his eyes soft. Then I reckon we got the right kind. The rain eased, leaving behind a world washed clean. The last light of day glowed amber over the hills. Clara took Ethan's hand and led him out into the open, where puddles shimmered underfoot and the grass bent under drops of silver. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When the stars came out, bright and close as lanterns, they sat together on the porch steps. The air hummed with crickets, the scent of rain fading into night. Clara traced the ring on her finger and thought about the long road that had led her here, the miles of running, the fear, the loss, the fire. Every moment had burned her down to something truer, something that could love again. She turned to Ethan. You ever think we were meant to find each other? He took a slow breath. I think sometimes the road bends us toward where we need to be. And when we finally stop fighting the turn, that's when we find home. Clara smiled, her heart full. Then I'm home. The night deepened around them, vast and peaceful. The world was quiet now, not empty, but alive with everything that had survived. And when the wind brushed across the plains, it sounded almost like a song, carrying the promise of all that would come next. In the days that followed, the valley bloomed wider than before. The garden thrived, the animals fattened, and laughter came often. The neighbors stopped by with congratulations and fresh bread. Nora wept happy tears and declared she'd known it all along. But for Clara and Ethan, the best moments were still the quiet ones, the mornings when light spilled through the window, the evenings spent watching the river catch the last colors of sunset. They didn't speak of forever. They didn't need to. Each day they chose it anew, in the soft rhythm of their lives. As summer turned to fall, Clara often walked the fields at dusk. Sometimes she'd look back at the cabin, the lamplight glowing in the window, Ethan's figure moving inside, and think about the road she'd once run barefoot through blood and snow. It had brought her here, to this quiet corner of the world, where love didn't need to be loud, to be real. One evening, she whispered to the wind. I stopped running, and the wind seemed to answer, You've come home. The story of Clara Hayes and Ethan McGraw is not just about love. It's about renewed faith after loss. It reminds us that sometimes we don't need someone to save us, but just someone patient enough to walk with us for a while. Life, no matter what age, can begin again. Grief doesn't make us weak. It makes us deeper, kinder, and more appreciative of simple things like the sunlight, the smell of coffee in the morning, or a hand holding us in silence. If you have ever experienced loss, ever felt lost, remember there is always a spring waiting after every long winter. Thank you for listening to the end. If you feel the warmth from this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again on other healing journeys, because every heart, even if it has been broken, still deserves to love again.